Hey, I'm Jacques Graven, and welcome to Hack the Hologram, the show where we get to explore what technology means to us as professionals, as well as all the nice, interesting hacks for day-to-day living. My focus today, common question we all have at the top of mind as soon as we begin a new project. How much does it cost? It's a very simple question, it seems, but the answer is rather complicated because it's different based upon what profession you're going to ask and what you're going to create. But if you're asking that question, the idea is very simple. You have an idea or a concept or a product or some venture that you'd like to bring into being. You're having the conversation with a technology expert and you need to kind of get a fair assessment, and you also don't want to be taken for a ride. At the same time, there's the contrast. You may be a developer or a digital agency, and you need to be quoting on such a process, and you're not really sure what the industry standards are and what you should be focusing on. My discussion today dives into that. We explore the hidden costs. We explore what the different areas are, what should be considered, and what is probably costing you more than it should, and why you should be paying maybe more for things that you are not considering. So let's get into today's episode. Okay, so for the sake of our conversation, I'm going to make a certain kind of assumption. The assumption is that the project that we're trying to create is some kind of web or software or mobile application. Now, obviously, you could be creating something else. You could be creating a new campaign. It could be a YouTube channel that you're launching. It could be a product. It could be a virtual reality principle. And a lot of those things you'll also gain insight to inside of this discussion. But for the sake of our conversation and to give us a frame, let's start with that assumption. The assumption is launching a new website or a new app. Now, there are three major categories that we need to consider looking at, and these are oftentimes not really seen. They're not always line of sight. The first of these categories is the most obvious one, the software, right? The solution, whether that is the actual program that you're building, the website, the app, it's essentially the thing that we think that we are getting into the project for. Now, the catch about this is that the software itself has certain dependencies, right? Whether you're going to create a software application, a web application, or a mobile application, it's going to be written with developers. In other words, you're going to have languages and frameworks that need to be considered, and different languages and different framework expertise all have different pricing structures around them that need to be considered. The next component that's oftentimes overlooked or sometimes seen as being part of the same thing is the infrastructure. The infrastructure is essentially the hosting. It is the technology that the solution or the software runs upon. Now, many of us are familiar with such platforms such as GoDaddy, WebAfrica, and all these traditional hosting kind of solutions. And the package seems pretty straightforward, $9 a month or 99 Rand a month, and you get your hosting solution. And people are always going, what's the cheapest, easiest package? Now, there's a very specific problem with that attitude or that mindset. That is a fantastic idea when you have a small scale group or you have a very controlled dynamic. In other words, you know what your basic use case is. You understand how many users are going to use your system. You understand how long they're going to spend and how much data is basically going to be spent on it. The catch is, it's not always that black and white. You may launch your application and then suddenly there's a gigantic spike in user bases. Now that same machine that was able to handle 1,000 requests at the same time is suddenly stuck handling 100,000 or more requests with a sudden major spike in data. The problem is, it's the same as logging into your computer or your laptop. Now, it's fine if you're using it, maybe somebody else that's remoting into it is using it, but now let's start adding to that exponentially. What's eventually going to happen is the machine is going to become unresponsive. The same thing is true with these lockdown standard hosting packages. Again, they may be fine for your specific use case, but if you're building complicated applications they're not necessarily going to stand the test of time. They're fantastic for the prototype phase, the initial marketing phase, but once you start gaining traction, you need to consider larger scale things. And this is where infrastructure really comes at its full kind of scope. Now we'll look more into detail about what that means, but some ideas that you may want to consider is you may deploy to platforms such as AWS, you may deploy platforms such as Google or Azure, and these have more complicated structures inside of them. Now suddenly the storage space is separate from the performance of the machine. That's separate from the networking that connects different machines. There's different solutions for each piece it takes. Now it becomes granular. This gives you far more control, but obviously requires far more expertise in order to manage it. Now suddenly you have to have somebody that has knowledge of containers, knowledge of networking, knowledge of scaling, and what vertical and horizontal scaling may even mean. Each of these have different scales because, for example, you may find that when you launch your application that it doesn't need more memory. Your customers aren't uploading images or media or anything like that. They're simply interacting with your application. So your storage space never actually requires increasing, but your actual performance of your machine and your availability of the machine, that does. So for example, your database may be fine, sitting exactly where it is, but the actual delivery route of that may be where your bottleneck is. This is what cloud architectures are all about, and that's why their billing is so very, very specific, and they range across each and every board. We'll get into that in a little bit more detail. The other, and one of the more overlooked kind of cost areas, is the UI and UX. You see, simply going to a developer, and even in that sense, going to somebody that is familiar with your hosting and your providers in that area, they may be able to keep your site up. They may be able to develop a site that is functionally sound, but you may be in a situation that nobody uses your system. You know, there was a long time ago where a lot of great CRM systems just lost all their clientele, and the simple reason for it is because their usability in comparison to other solutions on the market is completely gone. Now, this usability or this user experience first design approach might not have been popular 10 or more years ago, but it's become increasingly more in demand. In fact, when Richard Branson created or started working with his team towards his latest venture and they were designing these ships, one of the things that they were exploring was that it was a customer experience first design. And many companies, including Amazon and many others, are starting to recognize the value of that customer or user experience as the driving force behind what makes certain projects successful or not. In fact, I recall one digital agency that I led up the technical team for, a very popular bank in South Africa, approached us and asked if we could bring their loans department up from 2 million to 5 million. All we did is we focused on the user experience design as well as the related UI that came with that for their landing page, and we were able to increase that substantially, far beyond what was even requested inside of that simple brief. Now, that was a project that seems like a simple effort, but in truth, it's a project that took 4 months to accomplish. It took 4 months to accomplish because when we break down this idea of UX and UI, we recognize that they're actually very separate disciplines. UX is the experience study. It's the psychology of your users. That means you understand your users, your demographics, your psychographics. You understand all these things and you research and explore what is exactly that they are looking for. What is the focus and the core idea for it? And then out of that, you develop your UI. Now, the UI expert and the UX expert can be the same person, but they can also be two completely different people, because your UI expert may have knowledge in terms of how to not only design those components and those micro interactions that, you know, really creates the difference in your experience, but also understands how to implement them into code to hand that off to a developer, somebody that is more actively working in the software side, which could be the front end. So this can kind of overlap, but these are completely different disciplines and they need to be considered as such. Now, when you're working with a studio, you may find the blanket term that's often referred to as the full stack developer, right? The common idea for a full stack developer is somebody that does both front end and back end. But as you'll come to realize realized through our discussion today, this is far more complicated than what most people realize it to be. Most people simply take the blanket term of calling themselves a full stack developer when they only know one front-end language and one back-end language. They, for example, may be familiar with PHP and how to set up a basic server, and familiar with simple JavaScript and HTML. This is technically a full stack, but that person has no knowledge on how to suddenly now work in a Python framework or in a C# framework. These are very different disciplines and they need to be considered. Now, I'm not saying that all full stacks can't get there, but the idea is that it is a progressive line. Somebody that has that level of knowledge will often have a far greater level of seniority and has been inside of the game for many, many years. Now, we'll talk a bit more about maturity as we progress, but for now, let's just look at those three aspects. That's the three major cores that need to be considered and put top of mind when we're entering a project. Not only what technology and what language and what frameworks is your software going to run on, and what the disciplines and demands are for that. For example, your software may be built on PHP, or it may be built on Python. Or you may be making the selection because a developer is asking you, let's do this, or saying, let's do this because this is what they're familiar with. You need to consider what happens when that life cycle, that relationship ends. How in demand are those roles? What are the price tags behind those roles? And will you be able to support it? Because there's a very false perception inside of the areas of development technologies, which is the idea of going to build it once and it's going to run forever. If build once, run forever was a reality, then companies like Facebook, Twitter, and all of these will not still be hiring and fighting for the best developers in the game to keep up to date. But we'll explore why that happens a little bit further down. So then, when we look at the software, and let's just say we understand that, we've got a bit of idea of our user experience. Maybe you've done market research yourself. Maybe you have somebody that does that UI part of you, found a developer that can do it. Now, when we approach this, there's three major options that you're really sitting with. The first is software as a service. That is, for example, a Wix site or a Bubble.io. There are many others like this, but this basically boils down to a location or space where the software is hosted for you. The solution is hosted for you, and you have a degree of customization to do. This is the one that requires the least amount of technical effort. There's a basic monthly cost or so on, or a package cost that you pay, and you're allowed to go into that. You have a standard user interface or experience by which you can then build or create your application. And this has varied restrictions and costs associated to it, depending on the package that you choose. The next option is the DIY or the open source solution. Now, DIY and open source is pretty much one of the most common solutions out there, and it's because of the ownership that comes with this DIY option. For example, WordPress. I can use WordPress as a service. In other words, I can go to the WordPress blog and I can use it there, or I can download a copy of WordPress. And if I have hosting already and I've bought a domain name, or if I have somebody that can handle that for me, then I can simply deploy this to that environment. In fact, many hosting companies will actually provide you with a cPanel or control panel by which you can install many of these free open source solutions. Solutions like WordPress, Joomla, and all those that relate to it. There are many out there, including Shopify and many others, to meet a lot of basic needs. Now, the catch with this is the moment you want to start customizing it. The moment you want to start customizing that solution, that's where things become technical. And they become technical very quickly because you require somebody that has knowledge of that specific field. Okay, and it's also not a pick up and drop experience. If you want to take the idea of software development not as an architecture, I know that's the mode or the model that's oftentimes used to describe it, but it's not a perfectly accurate model. Think of software development more like writing a book. You may find a developer that speaks PHP, right, or speaks Python. That's the same way you may find any individual that speaks English or whatever your native language is. Knowledge or competency of a language does not suddenly translate to domain relative knowledge. In other words, just because somebody knows PHP does not mean they know WordPress. And just because they know WordPress does not mean they're familiar with how every single plugin inside of it works. This is important. The reason this is important is if you take somebody that simply knows PHP and he suddenly now has to take on a framework that he doesn't know, or maybe he knows the framework and he's fluent inside that framework, which means he understands the book, right? He knows the language, he can pick up the book, he understands the characters, and it's just a case of him kind of refreshing and seeing what are these other characters that have now been introduced in the second book, in the second part of the series. Once he's read through that, then he can add changes. If it's something that he's already familiar with, for example, the first book in the series, where it's just WordPress or it's just Joomla, that's no problem. He's very familiar, he understands the characters, he understands the dynamics, and he can very quickly add a new character into the story and make it fit the plot. However, if he's not read the second book, in other words, if you've now installed other plugins or other themes which are customized that you've bought from another person, or even another developer that you've bought from another developer that's worked on it, he still has to now read through it. He'll go through it faster than someone else because he's already familiar with the characters. So he'll catch things a lot quicker, but he still has to read through the book. In other words, he still has to read through the code of those new plugins or themes in order to understand what he can do without affecting the integrity of the software. This is very important because it's also where we see the maturity and the experience of your developer and his ability to make the right decisions that considers the scalability and the security and the usability of your software going forward. The other one, which is oftentimes considered pretty much the ideal solution and is also the most expensive solution, is that of custom development. Custom development, unlike any of the previous ones, does not come with any predefined rules. You can't go to a developer and say, give me Facebook. Facebook is a general term that can mean a lot of things, and you may not mean half of those things. Facebook has an ad system, it's now introduced Reels, it has developer APIs and consistent events with their F8 and many other things. It even has integrations into virtual reality solutions and all these. Most of those may not be even in your mind. And if you're just throwing that term around, chances are your price tag is going to look a lot uglier than what you were hoping for, when all you really meant is you want a social network where people can speak to each other, make friend requests, and share messages and updates on their information. Vastly different from give me a Facebook. Now, the idea, the catch here is that the moment we enter into the field of custom developments, our options go through the roof. And a competent development team can guide you through these options, but it is important that you know what they are so that you are not falling prey simply to the solution. Here's the big catch. Most people will look at a development and get very excited about that development. And I agree, it seems intoxicating. The first parts of the conversation is always great. The idea is coming to life. Now, you're a developer and you may even agree on a great set of times. You may say, it's going to take us a month, it's going to take us 6 months, it's going to take us a year in order to do it. Now, firstly, understand this. The average life cycle for software maturity is 2 years approximately. Now, it varies on for a number of factors, but that's how long it usually takes a piece of software to go through the lines of prototyping, development, user testing, feedback, changes, evolving, discovering of flaws in order to get to a space where it's actually market ready. So this jumping into the piece, getting a product out in the next month is possible. And it has been done and it can be done. It is dependent on the project that you are creating, but it's not the norm, right? And many people will make you those promises only to get your business without actually considering the consequences. One of those consequences is what happens when the software development is done and now it needs to be upscaled or technology changes overnight. And the same things that were true a week ago is not true anymore, because understand this, that the software development environment, the environment of technology is consistently evolving and changing, and you need to be aware of it. And there's so many disciplines inside of it that it's very difficult to be aware of it yourself. And this is why it is useful to work with somebody that knows what they're doing and that has run the miles with the experiences in the field that you are looking to work in. They understand your book and they know how to write the next great chapter into it. They're a great ghostwriter, if you will. Now let's look at this a little bit more in depth. So what does this mean? How does this relate to my pricing mechanism? You see, I like to break down the idea of pricing or understanding what you're really paying for into 4 major kind of areas. The first one then is, as we've spoken now already about, domain-specific knowledge. In other words, this is people that understand the level of information that you are working with. Now, for example, if you're going to take just your local developer that's never worked in Node, for example, and they've only done basic JavaScript and only basic HTML, it will take them longer to work on a specific Node application. So you're gonna pay more in the long run. You're gonna pay whatever that current fee is over the time that it's gonna take them to understand that book and get into its ideas in order to understand what's possible and what's not possible before they can start making changes. Now, versus if you're going to find somebody else that is experienced in that specific field, their initial price tag may be higher, but the time it's going to take them to achieve the objective is going to be significantly less. And that is really why you're paying for the specialization inside of a domain level. The same area of knowledge is important. For example, big data is a big term, right? It is one that populates everything, but there are so many fields and so many technologies inside of it. Some of them are outdated. Some of them are very difficult to use. If you're in a company that's using Cobalt, or if you're using a Solr backend database in order to do your search queries, that's a very different field. It has very specialized domain knowledge, and it's going to take a lot longer, especially because of the availability of documentation and material, for a developer that has no knowledge about that to find it versus someone who's got years of experience in that. That brings us to the second component, maturity. The seniority of the tech and the seniority of the individual that you are working with. A junior may oftentimes complete a function or a set of ideas in a time period relatively similar to the senior developer. It may not necessarily take them longer in order to do it. The catch is the cost in performance and the risk for unforeseen experiences. For example, your junior developer may be writing a very simple function. A function could be a piece of business logic, so to speak. Maybe this function is one that's responsible for sending out the email that you've now created to a list of users. Now, that junior developer may not have excessive knowledge of the libraries and of the core best practices inside of that language. That means that when they write that function, they may use loops and other things in excess outside of best practices. Some of the most common costs here is, firstly, it now makes that function more cumbersome and more complicated to read by other developers that now have to review that code or have to later on go in and fix it. So there's a time cost there. Secondly, because they're not writing the code in the most efficient way, when you're looking at deploying to cloud architecture and that cloud architecture is charging you based upon your usage, your performance on that graphics card or that motherboard, that actual IOP, that actual expense is now double because of the quality of that function versus when the senior wrote it. The senior was more familiar with the language, understood bottlenecks in performance, and tested for this when they wrote their function. They also maybe have better testing patterns that allowed them to understand the impact. The junior developer may be only focused on that function and not go and search through the code of every other piece of business logic that may be using that function as well, and as such may be breaking a function somewhere else, causing you another set of problems. Now, on top of that is simply experience. Your developer may discover things inside of that they weren't aware of, or you may release that only to find that it's not compliant with technology frameworks, or it may be suspect to an actual security vulnerability that's been known and is known to your senior developer because they've had the years of experience, and that's as simple as it is. You know, one of the biggest differences is just that experience where they've run into that situation which maybe in that very moment made perfect sense. But then when a clock changes maybe how it deals between time zones from one country to a next, that behavior is completely unpredictable. The junior's never seen that, they've never been exposed to that kind of complication, and that's again why the senior was oftentimes far more expensive but it's a scale, it's an investment that you're making early on in order to protect yourself going forward. And that's one of the big benefits of that. The next is the time, as we can see from this, the time of the amount of hours and the value associated to it. You see, because that's what it very much boils down to. If you have the available time to let juniors and people of mid-levels and people that lack certain experiences explore an idea, and you're not that invested in it and you're not running down on pressure, then it's fine. You have the time to let your team explore, discover, prototype, test, and go through those cycles. And you could probably get away with getting 5 junior developers where you could be, versus what you'd be paying for a senior or an architect. That's fine, but the problem is is time. How long it's going to take you to get to market, and if by the time you get to market, is the idea or the concept still relative? Let's be honest today. Many people look at technology as a frightening concept, and with good reason. There's so much going on in the field, but that's why you need to find the right people that you can work with, that you can trust with proven track records. Now, the catch is when we don't take action, we don't take that knowledge, every single idea, someone else is doing it. There's entire regions of the world dedicated to rolling out new technology advances and new experiences. Your wonderful idea, if you're not the one bringing it to market, someone else is going to bring it to market. And the thing about technology is that it's so mutable. It's so easy for someone else to do something similar to you and simply change the user experience design, and that's it. They've gone to market. It doesn't matter. You can't protect an idea, but you can't protect the implementation of a similar idea, especially around generic concepts like customer relationship management, booking engines. You may copyright that little experience and that little journey, but it's very simple to modify that journey and customize it to a different area. There's too many loopholes there. And as such, time is an important factor, and that is really what you're paying for. The next thing that you're also paying for is the scarcity of a resource. When you explore a certain piece of technology, if you're coming from a company that has already a set system, this is very common in many of the banks and many other areas where they're sitting in an inherited megalith. And a megalith is a term we use to describe a large body of code. This large body of code that they are sitting on basically makes it impossible for them just to rewrite. To rewrite would take years and many, many millions in order to accomplish that, especially if they have so much business value and rules driven on the system. This usually means that the developers in that area really have a benefit of scarcity. In other words, the technology is not a commonly used technology, and as such, it's more expensive. And this is something that we say old engineers and old database designers used to do, to their clients. They convince them to take up a technology, selling them on the idea that it's so great and it's so performant. And yes, it may even be able to meet your specific needs at a higher level. It may give you a few seconds or minutes of actual performance increase over your competitors. The catch is the developers for that, or the licenses associated to that, may also be 3 times what you are paying for. So it is important to understand how scarce that technology is. In other words, also how supported it is going forward inside of the market, and how easy it's going to be for you to find developers inside that area. This is also why in certain areas of technology, certain new budding frameworks will have consultants and experts that work on it that can charge very expensive rates. 8,000, 10,000 an hour is very common in the industry, versus others that are far more common that's going to charge you 800 Rand or so for a developer per hour, right? There's a massive difference in this, and that's why these are all factors that coincide with the technology that you're looking at. Right now, blockchain developers, virtual reality developers, all these specialized skills, machine learning, they have higher price tags because of their scarcity and their demand. There's so much demand for these industries, and there's limited resources of developers that can really do that, especially competent developers. So now looking at that, like what kind of applications do you get, right? So there's basic kind of ways that we can kind of group this just to help break down these differences a little bit more. First, there's web design. right? Web design or social, that's the more experienced, focused on marketing kind of thing. That's you quickly launching social media applications, that one-page marketing site, that WordPress site that you've popped up, or that single pager that's just there to act as a funnel towards actions or notifications of some sort. Then there's a little bit more of the complicated level, right? The web application itself. That is essentially an experience that usually has a function attributed to it or value that's specific. For example, selling actual products, or letting people subscribe to a service or use online tools. Next is pretty much native mobile versus hybrid mobile. You see, native mobile is when somebody specifically builds on a mobile application within its technology. That is, if somebody is building you an Android application and they're using Kotlin, or if they're working in iOS in its native specific language. Now, this is specialized, it's specific. Again, we're looking at scarcity. It's also going to be probably more performant, as we mentioned in series of that. But your ability to find more developers for it, to customize it, is going to also have a greater cost to that. So the counter of that is the idea of hybrid mobile or hybrid desktop applications. Tools like Capacitor, PhoneGap, and so on and thus forth. Ionic, there's many in the market. Essentially what this is almost a similar technology as web frameworks, using abilities such as JavaScript frameworks, in which case you're simulating the browser with extensions or the ability to create extensions that are native. This means a greater control over the look and feel of it, because you're now inheriting that same kind of freedom that we have in web over that normally restrictive platform of those set kind of technologies, desktop or mobile. As such, the development of it is a little bit faster, but it may not be as performant as a native solution. The benefit is there are many hybrid solutions, as I mentioned, and these hybrid solutions essentially compile to native, and you're getting a very similar piece, but there is a small performance difference in certain situations, or there may require certain customizations or the development of plugins that may not be readily available for that technology or that framework out of the box. The next is basically then specialization technology, right? So specialization technology would be everything in blockchain, machine learning, virtual reality, or development on the new Meta and Web3 kind of environments. So those are those, should we say, 5 kind of areas that you would look at essentially in developing your application. It's essentially that web marketing kind of site and social media platform. It's the complicated application specifically. It is then mobile and desktop, which is either then native or it is hybrid. And then it's the specialization technologies, things such as blockchain, machine learning, virtual reality, 3D, and all those others that can now stack on top of that. Again, this is pretty much a following tier that you can also progress in. You can choose to just do your digital marketing and test that, and then see from beyond that if it's worth going into other areas. Now, one of the things that we should look at is the approach. Once you've got this idea down, you know what you're kind of building, you know what your focus is going to be. You're going to do a mobile application, you need some infrastructure to handle the database and the storing or pushing of notifications. You've got some user experience stuff that you kind of figured out. So you've got a basic idea what your look and feel is going to be like. And you're ready to start, creating this thing. Now, there are several approaches that we can look at in order to determine how we're going to do that. And this is everything from base to personality style to company culture to process flow. This is important because the decisions we make here will oftentimes determine not only the success or failure of a project, but how long it inevitably takes and how much it inevitably costs for us. There are 7 very common. Now there are more, but there are these are the 7 ones I'd like us to focus on. That is waterfall, agile, prototype, rapid application development, extreme programming, lean, and scrum as the most common ones. So let's get into those very quickly. Now, these are just rudimentary overviews. I will do certain videos that really dive into these a little bit better so you can make better decisions around that. The first one, and probably the most known one, is waterfall. Now, waterfall was created by Dr. Winston W. Royce back in 1917. It's probably one of the most common approaches to development most people take. There's the requirements phase, we figure out what we're gonna do, then we design it, then we implement those designs, and once we've implemented those designs, we verify it, right? And once we verified it, now we just maintain it. So it's a very specific one, and this is really a useful model if you're releasing a marketing website. So if you're in that first kind of tier and state and you're just simply releasing something for marketing, in other words, you've got it completely designed. You know exactly what you want. There's no variance of it. There's no uncertainties. You're very clear. You've got a set deadline, set design, set things, and you can spec all of that and you look at that development, then that's an appropriate solution that you may want to look at, especially when you're in a set budget and you've got very specific constraints. However, this is an approach that will fail you in the areas of complicated development. In fact, there are many stories and examples where this idea or this entire waterfall approach may be completely wrong for you. But again, I want you to understand there are situations where it is right. The next one is not really a framework per se. It's more of a, shall we say, a philosophy. And that is the idea of agile. Agile was a set of manifestos. It was essentially a set of documents known as the Agile Manifesto, which was set up by multiple developers back in 2001, really as a way to kind of express their frustrations with that kind of old, outdated model of development. So the idea behind this Agile is far more circular. So there's the analysis of what we need to create, what we need to do, then there's the planning of it. From that planning, there's the designing of it. So we design really what we're going to do. We're implementing, we're creating this little piece. And then there's the testing of that piece. And we're deploying that as we're testing. And then we're giving feedback. And as we get feedback, we keep going back. From that feedback coming in, we now deploy, we now do analysis, we go design for this, we retest, we redeploy. And so on and thus forth. It's this continuous cycle where we're basically saying, look, we're not set on the specific objective or specific goal. We've got a general way that we're going, but we need to constantly refine that process and constantly get feedback on all these parts that we've tested. So that's kind of the core essentially of it, although it's quite simplified. The next very popular idea is very much called prototype. Prototype basically works as a way to demonstrate very quickly an idea or a concept so that business can basically approve it. Now, the catch is with prototyping is really the customer doesn't get to see it until the entire product is done. So there's no real feedback stage in a very clear way. Essentially, we still kind of do requirements, we do a quick design, then we build that prototype, and then we basically give it to the user or business to evaluate. And then we just refine that prototype, based upon that feedback. But a business is not really involved in that. We get the requirements, dev builds the thing, sends it to business, they go change this, change that. And then when that's now done and we all get happy, then we release it. So the problem is firstly that the client only gets something when it's already been designed, and there's a certain bias that kind of comes with that. You may be very specific on how things are supposed to be without actually having done the market research. We see that a lot in companies that are very driven by the ego and driven by the power of position and status, that they think they know all instead of actually testing market. And this is one of the areas where prototype falls flat. However, if you've done the research and you have industry experts making those decisions, it can work, assuming you've got the time for it. But understand that there is a basic gap. You're basically saying as a business, we're gonna let the developers decide. This is what we need, these are the specs, go ahead, let's prototype this and let's test it, hence the term. That really brings us to the next idea that's very connected to this. And that's the idea of basic rapid development. So rapid development is very much the same thing as prototyping. The only real difference is speed and cheap. Right? It's, in other words, we need to do this, we need to create something, but we need to very quickly do it. So essentially, we've got a much more shortened cycle. Requirements are given, a user design is basically kind of mocked up and then implemented, and then there's the cutover. It's this, and there's just that quick little cycle between the design and the development, and then the release. So there's very little space there in order to do that, but what that allows us to do is far quicker feedback. Because we're prototyping pieces far more rapidly, we're releasing them far quicker, it gets to somebody that can very quickly say, yes, no, I like it, I don't like it, change this. So it's better for feedback, but it's not necessarily better in terms of really getting the product out there. But if we don't know what we want, if we got a basic idea and we need to go and taste it, it's a great solution. It's a great way to quickly prototype a concept, get it done, especially in the areas where maybe you don't really know what you want, but you know what the requirements are for it, and you want to release that to your design and your dev team to start kind of deploying, and then they give that over and you can go, okay, this is great, let's release it, or let's just scrap it. So rapid development's another kind of methodology, but that kind of leads us over to something a little bit more effective, or a progression on this idea, in my mind at least, and that's the notion of extreme programming. So firstly, extreme programming is far more catered to the programmer. It's far more catered to the developer, and it's about creating solutions that really make the environment for your devs a better one to work in. Extreme programming is essentially, as I said, it's developer focused, and what it allows us to do is examples such as peer programming, where instead of the one developer sitting and coding in isolation, 2 or more developers will sit together on a whiteboard and draw out the solution together. Now, this tends to give you a better quality code, but it may also take longer for implementation and release. So it is more focused on a better ecosystem for your developer. And if you have an established product, this may be a fantastic solution for you. It gives us the test first programming methodology as well. It gives us the continued integration. And it's also where we get the concept from incremental releases and incremental design changes from, because the developers are actively working and actively testing together on this process, and they're kind of leading that. They're responsible for that, and they're responsible for regular and continuous changes. So as they fix changes and release things, these automatically get deployed and get released. There's no separated peer review cycle. The review cycle is together. The programmers will sit together, look at the code together, come up with the solution. One person will code it out while everyone looks at the same screen. So they're basically testing it at the same time, peer reviewing it at the same time, and then releasing it at the same time. Now, depending on your group of people, that could be a problem, but if you have a team of pretty senior people and a pretty mature product, that is an exquisite way to go through. In fact, I know many banks that follow that same methodology inside of their approach. Now we come to Lean. Lean is an agile framework, but it's specifically aimed at cutting waste and optimizing the efficiency of the process. You see, the goal is essentially to deliver the project in less time and on budget, right? And who doesn't like that idea? The focus of Lean is to scrap away all the nice to haves. It's not about all these, let's add this, let's add that, let's do this because we think it's cool. It simply is about identifying the value, right? The value, that's it. It's not all these other nice things and let's add that and let's add this to create a complete ecosystem. It's let's just focus on that one thing. Early stages of Twitter can be an example of it. I'm not sure if that was the methodology, but you have a company there that essentially was nothing more than a digital SMS, right? It was 140 characters back in the day, and that was it. It was an SMS that was shared on the timeline. That was it, right? It was purely focused on the value and nothing more. It didn't distract from all the other 100 things. There's not like Facebook. If you go on there, there's a million things that you probably haven't even ever used in your life, but it's there. So the idea with Lean is that we identify the value, we then map the value stream, we start creating a bit of a flow around this, and we establish a pull, and then we seek perfection. Right? It's this kind of circular kind of process, essentially, where we're just identifying what our core focus is, we're mapping it inside of our process, we're creating a method for releasing it and bringing it in, we're creating a pull request into the code and we're releasing it into that, and then we're constantly just seeking perfection. It's very much a Google model in that sense, where we find what works and we keep iterating on that and that alone, and we cut out all the other things that we consider maybe nice to haves. My favorite approaches, and that is the Scrum methodology. You see, Scrum again is another agile model, and it puts an emphasis, basically, communication. So one of the things that it really avoids as much as possible is that developers are taking too long in isolation and that groups get too big so that no one knows what's going on. Inside of a Scrum methodology, groups are usually considered small. There's the phrase that says a developer team should at the end of the week be able to be fed on 2 pizzas alone. Now, it depends how hungry you are, but you get the idea. In other words, a developer team should never exceed more than 7 people. 4 to 6 is a very common kind of strategy inside of this. But that's the idea, they're small. The other thing is that each and every member of the group is completely automated. In other words, they don't have to go get approval from another group in order to get something done. They're completely self-contained so that there are no blockages inside of the group. Now, in Scrum, you don't necessarily have, you may have a goal and objective, but it's not locked down. In other words, it is changeable, it is mutable. In fact, Scrum was made popular during the development of the FBI's program, a program that failed for many years to see the light of day in many millions. And when the developer of Scrum kind of entered the project and they asked him, how long is this going to take? He said, I'm not really sure, but I can give you deliverables every single week. These weeks can be a week, it can be 2 weeks, it can be a month, and they're known as sprints. So development teams inside of a Scrum methodology works in sprints, which are controlled small units of time with set deliverables inside of that. And the principle behind this is that every single piece of work known as a user story is demonstrable in full at the end of a sprint. In other words, it gets released and business can immediately test it and immediately give feedback instead of waiting for a complete solution or a complete prototype to be finished before they give feedback. So that's one of those core kind of differences inside of it. And because of that, there's certain methodologies or patterns inside of Scrum that really aids to this. The first is a stand-up. Stand-up is a daily activity where all the developers just talk about what they're busy with, where they are, and what they're stuck in. So if somebody's stuck in an area, instead of them getting caught in that for a long time and tunneling, they get to share that so that members of the team that are more experienced can be aware of it and business can be aware of it in case there's going to be delays in a release. The benefit though of Scrum is that you're constantly delivering value the whole time. And that means every month or every week, your users are getting something new. And this, especially combined with some of the other methodologies that we learned here, if you're value driven with your clients and you're constantly looking at feedback, this is oftentimes where you're going to get a more successful project. The problem is when you think your developer knows what he's doing and he may be exquisitely competent in his skill, but very incompetent in your specific business model. This allows you to get very quickly into those feedbacks. There is also why in Scrums we have something known as retros. Retros at the end of each week, the team sits together because it takes on the philosophy that it's not necessarily the individual that's the problem, it's the system. Where they don't maybe feel safe enough to talk. They don't feel the stories have got enough qualification to them. There may be different communication. So every week that is looked at and the system itself is improved upon to improve communication and to improve flow of that process. Okay, so now that we've understood that, we understand that not only are these different disciplines or different areas of the technology that need to be looked at, but there's also different approaches, and each approach is going to also determine pretty much how long a project's going to take. And you may need to very quickly prototype something that just so you can get out to see if this proof of concept even works, so you can get people to test it out. Or you may have a general idea and you may have the budget and you're ready to grow and achieve those goals. Or you may have to just kind of figure out that one single bit of value that you need to deliver. Once you understand this, you can pick an approach or a methodology, and you also can understand how your team is going to work, because different personality types work differently. If you're in the old digital agencies, many of them love a waterfall approach. It works. They get the idea, they design it, they give a deadline, and they blow that out. A lot of young people with a lot of energy and a lot of great ideas, they may not always have that much experience, but they're not usually designing things that need to stand the test of time. They're designing things that need to launch and get attention. That's the reason you're booking an agency. Versus the area of product development may have a completely different model. They may choose a Scrum or a Lean approach and adopt the Agile methodology, which is far more effective as methodologies for creating software for long-term growth and success, where you're getting feedback and you're getting change and you're growing along with your market and along with the customer base that you are serving. And you also want to consider the developers' needs, their communication. These are human beings themselves. They're not machines. They just work with machines at a very effective level. Now, the next area that we need to look at is to break down pricing even more, is to understand that pricing is different based upon department. So there are several major departments that one needs to be aware of when you're going into a development. Some of them are considered and some of them are not considered. You may find yourself in a benefit of knowing somebody that does a lot of these things, but it's very, very rare to have someone that can stay up to date with all of these. It is simply impossible. There are too much. There are thousands of articles being released on machine learning and data science daily and weekly. There's thousands upon thousands of new security vulnerabilities coming out every single day. It's impossible for one individual to stay on top of all of these fields. And this is why usually when you're working with a studio, there's people in charge of each of these departments, and these are full departments, independent and collaborative inside of major agencies and companies. Now, again, you may find yourself in the benefit of working with somebody that has knowledge of many of these fields, and that may get you through those first years of your business. But as your business starts to grow and it starts to gain demand in the bigger, larger market space, you're gonna have to look and consider all those areas independently so you can get people that specialize in to grow those things. So let's look at what those are. The first one is UI and UX. Now, we spoke about this earlier when we kind of broke out those three major arenas, but user experience design and user interface design are core disciplines that make a major difference in our life. And out of this, there's more disciplines that's come out. There's conversational experience design if you're looking at chatbots. There's an entire psychology behind what makes a conversation flow and seem natural to a customer. There is customer experience design where you're looking at somebody going into your store and actually the psychology that goes in to determine when they're going to buy, what they're more likely to put in. That idea of whenever you walk into a discount or to many stores where all the sweets are in that queue on the way, because it's that last little stretch, right? And part of their journey is keeping people in the store longer. The same thing about your experience. If somebody enters your site or your app or anything like that, it may do the absolute best on the market. But if your experience design is not really there, there's no interaction when the web connection goes down or when it becomes unresponsive, that's just going to frustrate your user and he's going to leave and you've lost a client. Right? That's your marketing is all there. It's really right there beyond your actual marketing. That's the thing that they experience and that's how they relate to you as an individual. So user experience can be quite large, and so is UI. And in this, we get other fields that kind of classify and connect to them. Fields like graphic design and media that creates from that. And we'll speak about media in a bit. But let me give you a quick example there. There are companies that'll charge you 250 Rand for a logo. And there's companies that'll charge $100,000 for a logo. The difference is experience, right? The difference is user experience. The one may just be a designer and a graphic designer, and he's simply applying the principles of design. That's it. He understands rule of thirds, he understands color theory, he understands spacing, he understands symbology, he understands all of these things, he understands typography. So he understands everything technically, right? Same as that junior, senior kind of difference. And he can do all those things and execute those things perfectly. The user experience designer, however, may not even know any of those things. It's very unlikely. Most likely your user experience designer will know a lot about that. Many times art directors, all user experience designers. Now, somebody in these levels, they understand the psychology, they understand the market, they understand what's looking for, and they're able to guide you through that experience yourself to understand the value of what you are producing. That's when, there's a certain sound that gets anchored inside of your market. They know how to anchor that sound. We see that with the example of BMW. There's many others where they have fragrances or ideas or concepts. They're very simplistic, but they understand how to make that sign the trigger that you get to link with your product. The same way as the creators of the toothpaste realized that it wasn't the fact that this thing was clean. The idea of the foam or that kind of slight burning sensation that some toothpastes leave in your mouth actually became the trigger. And they anchored the idea that when your teeth weren't feeling that your mouth wasn't fresh. And that the moment you felt it, that equaled that your mouth feels fresh, that your breath is fresh. And that's what was the trigger that made the product sell. That's what you pay for. You pay for expertise in human psychology and persuasion design that is effective. Now, that also opens up other fields, ethics and how we play with ethics, but that's another conversation. But understand that that's why there are fields like ethic engineering happening inside of the areas of robotics and even in the areas of design, because you need to be certain that the kind of quality experiences you're creating are actually to the benefit of your users. And then beyond that, we move into the UI. And that is when do we animate? What does it look like? How does it respond on different devices? You know, is that color tone good for people with that have color blindness? Is all of those things being considered? All of that goes into that, and it's a big overlooked idea because we sometimes assume the design just happens. It does not just happen. It is deliberate work. People will say, you know, just make it simple. And there's an idea in UI and UX which is that if it's simple, it's more expensive. Because when it's simple, it means we need to actively take out more of those features and really work on what's specialized and really simplifying those concepts. So less is more, quite literally, in this field. It's understanding how simplicity in design creates the difference in the user experience, and as such the difference in their buyability and their behavior. And this is an important, essential step in an entire set of disciplines on its own. Next now is the actual front end side, so to speak. This is when we move beyond now just creating those symbols, those components and things like that. And we get to the first kind of tier of the code, right? This can be anywhere where your JavaScript developers are quite popular, your front end developers. And in this, we find frameworks such as Vue.js, Angular, React, and several others. These are constantly growing in the areas and they move in different areas of complexity. Libraries like Raphael.js, Pixie.js, 3JS allows us other ways that we can create these interfaces in such a way that they operate on mobile devices, that they can do 3D, that they can do 2D interactive charts and experiences, as well as integrating an API so that they can work and talk and relate and trigger the camera. It is all that bit of code logic. It's when we've moved out of the initial design layouts that we've received from the UI and the UX department, and they've designed, and all those wireframes and those beautiful designs have now been locked down. Now it moves into the part where the front end developers are now coding that. Now it's possible that you can have somebody that does both of these two disciplines and even one that does this and the next one. But most cases in many studios, you'll have dedicated resources for this. Because again, as I mentioned, specialization is a different thing, right? And understanding the seniority of a skill set determines a lot of differences. So in the front end component, that is where we're looking at actually coding that site or that application so it does behave in the correct way, responds correctly across the different devices, interacts the way it should against different speeds and performances, against different browsers, because that's also the idea. Just because the developer is building the application now and it works fine in Firefox does not mean it works fine in Chrome or Safari. Each of those different browsers have different technology that it runs onto. And because of that, and even the different versions and the different operating systems will determine different behavior. And this is why you usually have somebody that's competent in those areas and they can test against those different devices. And if you're in a company and you're looking and working with this, you may have physical devices that meet and match those, which is always the most ideal. There are also software solutions that simulate this, but I need you to be aware that those software simulations are not 100% accurate. Even if you take your old Internet Explorer, if anybody still remembers that, and you use that to simulate a previous browser and you had to put that on an actual machine that runs that browser with that version, your results will vary. It's because of that these things are important. It's looking at how that responds, the difference on a screen in a Mac versus the difference on a screen on a PC. Each of these are factors that need to be considered, as well as now that experience that sounded so good in the design need to be coded out. And out of there's the choice of technology, and that choice of technology carries a cost to it, depending on what you do. And these are the factors that we spoke about earlier. The next thing that we need to then look at, obviously, is the backend. So the backend is essentially the core. And if you're looking at a typical application where the front end is your experience, right? It's what's seen, it's the look and feel, it's how it behaves. The backend is the business logic. It's not necessarily your database, even though many people will link database inside of it, but it is usually what acts as the intermediate between your database. There's a phrase in development known as the MVC model, or the model view controller. The view would be what you see. That would be what we described in the first kind of components. Then there is the actual controller, which is the business logic. It's the business rules. It's the thing that determines this action means that you need to be authenticated and we need to lock your information or store your information or process that. And that interacts with the model. The model is what represents the database. It's essentially an interface on your data. Now that can be happening in many other areas. It could be on a MySQL database, a Postgres database, an SQL database. There's several others. There's several NoSQL databases. There's many formats here which are methods that store data, and they are important because they vary based upon the scale and the growth. In other words, you may have something small, a prototype, and you may even choose to use a different database for your user registration and user logins, but you may have something that has to process big data for machine learning, in which case you may use a completely different database solution specifically for that, and even inside of that, different database architectures. But essentially, when we look at the backend, we're predominantly speaking about core programming languages: PHP, C#, C++, Golang, Python, and these. We can use Node. There are JavaScript models for this, but this is not the most commonly used in older infrastructures, but it is something that is increasing in popularity and in use cases. Now, this is usually where the API is, the application programming interface. This is the logic that the front end will speak to determine its access to not only the database, but to other microservices. Let's look at that in the next one. So that kind of introduces us then over to the idea of DevOps. DevOps falls into many areas. It falls into how does that code that's now been developed, that application that's now been developed, how does that get deployed into the web, right? Where does it have a continuous deployment cycle? Does it get tested when it releases to the cycle? What exactly is that process? When it does, how does it scale up? Does it sit inside of containers? Does it sit on a set server? What is that server? What is the requirements for that server? Are we separating that information? You know, here is where we move into quite a large domain of disciplines. Inside of this domain of disciplines, there's varied experts in many specific areas. We can, for example, have a megalith application, which is a single application that deploys and it's hosted on a single VM or virtual machine. And that virtual machine does absolutely everything. It's a very simple case situation. It's not an ideal case situation because the problem is scalability. If we find that we're running into a bottleneck because of space or networking or database speed, we're stuck. We can't just scale up because we've limited resources. And if we suddenly copy that over, now suddenly the application doesn't have access to the latest database information. So at the very least, we want to separate the database out of that. And this is where we get the ideas of containers. Containers and separate services in each of the different providers, AWS, Microsoft Azure, Google, DigitalOcean, and many others, each have their own offerings specific for these. So knowledge of the one does not immediately translate to knowledge of the other, but it does give a very good starting point. A developer that has knowledge of the one should, in most cases, find very relatively similar ideas. In fact, if you're entering into the Huawei cloud, and you were an AWS developer, you'll find the environment very familiar because it's quite literally the same naming conventions in most cases. But those naming conventions are slightly different when you step into Google or into Azure. But with a little bit of orientation, you can relatively quickly find these things, but each of them have different rules. The networking speeds may be different, the performance, the sectors, the pricing, the costing to each of these are factors, and this is where your DevOps experts really come in. They need to understand what are those services, what are the costs, and they need to constantly be testing these to see where your bottlenecks are. How can things scale? Are there a load balancer in front of this? Will you deploy multiple containers to release to different environments so that it can handle more hits or more traffic towards your application? And then what exactly is the demands of your application? And this is where your application can now start to be broken down into microservice components. You may find that your application is doing massive processing, because of a machine learning pattern that you have in there. Maybe you're processing human images in order to recognize authenticity, or maybe you're trying to recognize emotional patterns inside of a base of images, or you're trying to tag them with labels. That may be quite an intensive resource to process. That idea can now be separated out into its own micro application and microservice, and your main service can just request that, where that now runs on a different server in the background. Maybe a server that doesn't have the same cost because it's not needed to be as on demand as the other one. And that allows you now to let that run overnight and simply send the client an email the second that thing is ready for them to download or to access. All these things are major factors because they have major costs associated to them. And this is why DevOps can be the biggest area. Now, DevOps in a discipline can also just describe the DevOps, the actual operations of the developmental environment, the working and the fixing of bugs and things like that. But for the sake of our conversation, we're describing this to be the area that looks at your infrastructure inside of it. That brings us to its natural counterpart, security. Now, many people will actually link these two fields together. In fact, the new discipline that's really growing in its value is the concept of DevSecOps, that we're not doing security and testing and pen testing at the end of an application's release, but we're actually doing it during the actual deployment and continuous integration cycle that we find in the DevOps section. This basically, if we look at security, this is one of those many areas. It's also why I say there's a big risk when you're looking at open source solutions or things like that. When you're looking at open source solutions, the second open source hits the next release, they release a bug statement or a fix statement that basically says in the public domain, these were the problems, this is what we did about it. Okay? So that's great, but the catch is if you're not staying up to date and you've still got that WordPress site or that Joomla site running out there, and somebody else who is a serious professional hacker is writing his scripts in the background to now search the web for sites with that exploit's available, that gives him access to your system. This doesn't mean you're a target, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that you're being attacked because someone's out to get you. There are hackers out there simply trying to hone their skills, and they'll just write scripts that'll find exploitation so they can send those out into the web and actually just find vulnerabilities. Because firstly, if they find a vulnerability in your site, they've got a solution they can sell, and maybe they have information if they're more malicious in order to do that. And this is where we get the idea of the white hat hacker and the black hat hacker. Somebody that is there for the positive and there for the negative intention. Now, here's the catch. Somebody may use one of those exploits. If you have an outdated WordPress plugin or a bad patch on a server because the PHP version is out of date, because you're not paying attention to your DevOps or your software is not being up to date, that means that person can now find that exploit, and in finding that exploit, they can run a patch into it, gain access to the system, and once they're in the system, they can increase their security privileges, escalating it potentially up to a root level. If they have root level access to that system, they've got control. Now you may be saying, oh, that's not a big deal. I've got backups of my code and they're sitting on a server, that's over there in the other environment by some other hosting company. What's to stop that individual from hacking your system, turning it into a honeypot, affecting the people that are logging into it, in essence, stealing their IP addresses, and then being able to perform attacks from your server on theirs and even to yours when one of your staff members connects to that server via FTP or some other insecure protocol. And when they do that, accessing or infecting a file or something that's downloaded, or gaining information, and as such then accessing your machines in your local environment and creating the vulnerabilities for it. Cybersecurity is something that is on the rise as cybercrime is on the rise. As we look to the recent events with Ukraine and Russia, now becoming a cyber hacker is ever more popular, and there are courses for free on YouTube right now that can teach you complete A to Z in hacking, from Wi-Fi hacking to actual proper penetration testing. This is an area that needs to be taken seriously. In fact, a professional security company that does pen testing on a site simply to scan your website in order to look for vulnerabilities inside, on average will charge 70 to 100,000 Rand per assessment. And many in South Africa are aware of some of the major institutions that were hacked and the vulnerabilities of the user and the customer information. Even TransUnion was responsible for the credit information information of many clients recently got hacked. And all that information, that compromise, gives the hacker vulnerable user information in an area that they're most vulnerable to, their credit scores and their credit and financial statuses. These are big risk things that can lead to you being sued or you being in a structure. So when you're just paying that 2,500 Rand for a quick WordPress site from that local little dev, you know, that's just your friend, put something nice on there, and you decide that you've got a commerce plugin that's now storing users' information and just their credit card details, just to make life easier, you may be looking at a far more expensive lawsuit on your hand if you haven't considered these things properly. So that leads us then obviously to the idea of it's not always easy, and you can't always do those things in one go. And it's completely fine that you do them in pieces and portions, but these are the areas that you need to be aware of and you need to consider in the long term if you're going to take the business serious. You can make millions on this project and on your developmental goals. In fact, we all are familiar with Elon Musk, his recent acquisition of Twitter for $44 billion. That's over 670 billion Rand if you're in South Africa. That's a preposterous amount of money. That's an idea or indication of some of the values that tech companies or tech solutions are creating. It's part of the industry and it's not going away, and it's the only way to do business. In fact, if you're not building, if you don't have an online presence in the worlds of pandemics and wars and chaoses, you're not going to be heard of, and you're not competing, and you're at a loss. And that brings us to the final component of this, because even after you've done all of this stuff, that doesn't mean anyone's going to be aware of you unless you put in the investment and time in the marketing. Now, a good marketer can get you from many kind of angles, and everyone takes the typical kind of marketing routes. They create a social media page, not understanding why these things were made in the first place, and they're stuck in those situations, right? They're creating an Instagram and a Facebook page, not really getting traffic because they don't understand how content should be produced. Content creation inside of marketing is educational content that is oftentimes story driven and takes strategy and quality filming and quality experiences. You know, many cases, even this video that you're watching now is a form of content marketing. It's a form of marketing and educational based, because obviously I run a digital agency, but I don't want to constantly sit and explain to my clients these fundamental things, right? I want them to be able to go and watch these videos and understand why we charge the amounts we do because of the value of the service. But if they're just gonna pop onto our site and just see that price tag or anything, they're gonna go like, oh no, wait, not. Because, you know, their auntie knows how to do a little WordPress site and she once designed a flyer, so she's got an eye for design. Not the same thing. Even marketing itself is a specific strategic kind of effort. Just because John or Bob can put up your Facebook site or your social media site, it doesn't mean anything. Firstly, the reason anybody even wants to do social media in the first place is part of a bigger strategy. The reason everyone got into it wasn't because you needed a Facebook page or an Instagram page or anything like that, and that's where your clients were. Yes, you can generate, and there's many effective strategies to market and reach that audience, hence why I pointed out a specific stage of this process dedicated just to that marketing site and that marketing social media page. But the main reason these were done is for SEO reputation management. When on your website's SEO, in terms of your rankings on search engines, somebody looked at that, one of the earliest things that they looked at was domain reputation management. And if your site was being referenced or linked in relevant content in high-ranking sites such as YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, all these other, Twitter, and there were a lot of references and they were relevant and had a lot of engagement, that would naturally increase your reputation and raise you in the search engine rankings. That's why those things were originally there, but that landscape has evolved because everybody is now doing it. There's so much out there that it does require strategy. And that strategy comes with rich, powerful content creation methods. Look at the most successful ones out there, and you'll realize they're not just putting out value. Our show is more dedicated to just putting out value and educating the market and giving you solutions, because that's what what we're passionate about. But most of those are purely driven by storytelling and things like that. If you're an adult, you probably got kids, and I'm sure your kids watch YouTube, and what are they watching most of the time? Silly stories, right? People using video games as characters and stuff and describing stories for them, because stories sell. When you work with a marketing agency, you're working with somebody that understands the power of narrative and storytelling in order to make your application, your solution, relevant to your audience, where you're no longer expressing yourself as the big key, but the guide to the key for them to experience the journey that they're looking at. These are the major stages inside of that. Now, before we end this, I want to just highlight there's a very gigantic risk of going cheap. When you're going cheap, you're not really considering infrastructure. You're not really considering security. You're probably just putting out social media content that you're paying for that has no specific strategy, and as such is not being measured. And the analysis of that is not being taken. It's not being done anything of value with, so that your investment can start returning, value to yourself. You're just doing it because people say, oh, you should have a website, or you should do that. Without strategy, without good reason, you're not really going to get the return that you want. There is a higher cost for that, but there's also a much higher return for that. But we need to also recognize this, that there's another cost that needs to also be looked at, and that is management. You see, maybe if you've watched this video end to end, or you watched this series end to end, you will probably have a lot of things that you are aware of now, but you need to do your own research on that, or hire somebody that that you can work with that understands all these things and then can manage these varied teams to operate together. We call these things everything from product owner inside of the Scrum methodology to team management to all these other wonderful ideas, but it boils down to that same concept, that management is the unseen cost. When you work with companies and you work with agencies, there's usually going to be somebody that is another salary that's being paid, that is there involved in the management of this, to make sure these people are talking to each other, are showing up, are doing what they need to. And you may outsource that to a degree to software, time tracking solutions and things like that. But record zero and information shows that time tracking really actually has a counter effect on it. Human engagement is one of the most effective tools for it, and that does mean relationship. If you're just sitting in a place where you're being directorial to your staff or to your team or your development group of this is the deadline, that's when it needs to happen, you're destroying morale. And where there's no happiness and there's no energy, the people are not going to work together, and that's fundamentally going to cost you even more. If your younger staff and your younger people in the crew don't feel like they have an opinion, don't feel the right to make mistakes, don't feel that, it's ultimately going to cost you your company. But if they feel that they're in an environment where they can express themselves, they can make mistakes, they can learn, and that you are flexible, you have strict rules and you're responsible in that sense, and you have that, parental kind of support, but that parental kind of direction, then things are going to be a lot different from something where everyone's just showing up to make a paycheck. Make sure that relationships is at the end of the day at the heart of your dynamic, because even though people are in tech, very tech, right? It's very easy for developers to lose themselves to the human emotions and get so caught up in the pure logic that sometimes it seems like they don't feel anything. And you get so caught up in the deadline that sometimes you don't care. That's the thing that costs you more. One of my favorite stories is that of the team behind Final Fantasy, one of the most successful franchises in the video game and even areas of film and many other areas of retail. This is a company that doesn't release a product at a set time. They say that's the estimate and we'll release it when it's perfect. There's many others that do the same thing. It's exciting to go for deadlines. It's exciting to make that commitment and plan all those things because we want to have control over everything. This oftentimes makes us release a product that is not battle tested and isn't ready, versus setting those timelines after you've created something and after you set it into development. It's fine to make promises, but that promises usually stems from a place of insecurity and a need to prove yourself, and it's not a mark of maturity. Most developers, and that's something that I want you to recognize, will reluctantly agree to a certain deadline. A real experienced developer, a real experienced development team will say, yeah, we can aim towards that, but we're going to give our best and we're going to work on these things, but they'll be able to be measurable at every single stage, and that's what you're more interested in. Work with people as people, not machines. Now, before we end our discussion today, I want to talk quickly about the unnamed evils. There are what I see as 3 specific unnamed evils inside of any development project that end up costing you far more and is probably the main reasons why your development projects fail or have failed in the past. That's technical debt, product maturity, and technology updates. So first is technical debt. Technical debt simply boils down to a lack of clarity. We go into a concept, we're going to start working on it, and let's just figure it out as we go, right? Or that's the example that we had in the early part of this process. Give me a Facebook, give me that. It's not specific. Whenever you're working in development, whenever you're working in tech, if a project or an idea is not very specific, if the story is very broad and general, it will equal technical debt. In other words, it'll take longer and it'll cost more than it was intended for. And it's very easy for us to do that because it's a mental effort, right? To go and do that level of thinking and that level of detail. This is why your UI and UX end up costing you so much, because who wants to do all that detailed thinking and pre-design things and work through everything? But that's what you need to do if you want to end up saving money in the long term and time, and you want to have a better relationship with your team and more successful one. Sit and work through everything in advance before a single piece of code or design is done. Do wireframes, work through the logic. What happens when I click on this? What does it do and what does it not do? You need to be specific so you can define what a bug would be and what a bug wouldn't be. Most of the time we only find these things out afterwards because we did not specify that. When you're working in development teams or where your developers are working, they're not going to have the time always to do that, because in that initial week, that initial day, they're just getting loaded with tasks and they need to tick these off and get to the next one because there's a timeline looming, right? Or there's Friday, or there's beer hours, or there's all these other things. They're human beings, right? Human is a natural part of our process, right? There's no escaping being human, and we need to recognize our strengths as well as our flaws. Technical debt is the result of a lack of clarity both in yourself and how every single part will work and what will happen when it doesn't do that and what those roots are. If that can be communicated in conjunction with your story, a full user test case can be written and that test case can be coded for. If that test case can be coded for, that means that when that gets released, it can be tested every single time, including when we add new features. That makes you instantly aware when a new problem gets introduced and how to fix it and what it is before it grows into something more dangerous. The next is product maturity. You know, the journey from proof concept versus prototype and all that. Everyone has these ideas that, you know, we're going to develop this thing right now and it's going to be done. It's not going to be done. Right? You may get something that's relatively close to done, relatively close to process, but as I mentioned before, the average life cycle of project maturity is 2 years. Initially, what will happen more realistically is you'll come up with a concept, you'll give that with a development team, and you'll create this project. And once you've created that initial project, that initial prototype, that initial proof of concept, then that's going to be tested with your users, with your groups. And it's not a good idea to just suddenly release this to the whole world, because they're not only going to wreck it, they're going to find mistakes that you haven't thought about yet, but it's going to destroy your reputation. Versus completely controlled releases. You're controlling to a certain demographic, a certain group of people at a certain time. And now what happens is you can immediately quickly get feedback, especially if you're releasing little features early on, and you can work on that feedback and make changes. Once you do that, you can realize you've been working on this thing for so long and your market actually wants something completely different. But now you've invested all that money in a marketing campaign and a release campaign and all this stuff, and now you're stuck, you're into it, and then it just causes more stress and more drama, and everyone's quitting and your project's going up in flames and costing more than it should. Prep yourself for a long-term piece, right? Because once that product's built, it could be perfect. Once you deploy it, you may now discover, oh, we need more server power than we realized we required. We need to actually refactor this complete component because technology changed. And let's look at that. You see, that's the last kind of idea, and it's the idea that we exist in technology in a changing landscape. Any technology or any language or any framework or any infrastructure or even design that you're going to work on is going to be different tomorrow. All the time, every day, somebody somewhere is working on improving all of these things. New security flaws are being found, they're being patched. Those patches need to be integrated. New design principles are starting to trend. Those design principles need to be applied. New software technology or frameworks are going out of date because of vulnerabilities found, or more efficient methods are being found. And that means your application that was built perfectly needs to stay up to date. It needs to be maintained. Now, the good news is that it's very rarely a case that means you have to change it every single day, but it means that every few months there's going to be some kind of patch or some kind of update, sometimes even every other week. That means that the technology will constantly need to be monitored and improved. You need to check it if it's constantly costing you costs in an area that it shouldn't be, and you need to be working at improving that. You need to be looking at other perspectives, what other markets are doing, what are growing trends in those areas so you can stay ahead of it. What are patches, what are software updates, operating system updates, all these things. These are the underlying core tech. If you're working in a certain technology level, and then suddenly that whole technology is made known for having a product vulnerability, and that patch is being released, you may have to not just install that patch, but you may have to update certain entire areas of your application in order to do that. Have you considered this? Netflix has a great philosophy known as chaos testing, in which they will actively at different times break unrelated parts of the system, cut a network cable, break a hard drive, to see how the system responds to these things. And this is an important context. Now, again, this is a far more matured context, and it's taken time to get there. And I don't want you to get into the idea of thinking, oh, I have to have all of this stuff in place to get there. You don't. Most never do. Many companies never have all of these things that I've mentioned to you inside of this series even in place, or have even considered they're able to build successful products and really achieve great results with their product that are very profitable. But these are the varied areas that you want to look at, and the different areas that you could be costing money in or losing money in because of lack of consideration. Once you understand all of this, you understand all the possible areas, or all the main ones at least, where you could be spending money, so you can now better plan for it. And if you are someone running a digital agency, or you're a freelance developer or something like that, now I hope you've at least got more ammunition or more tools that you can educate your clients on, so that they aren't upset because of something that they didn't know was a requirement, or wasn't a tool, or you didn't know how to position. So I hope this concept or this series has been helpful for you in better understanding that next development project that you're out to create, or that next project that you're out to manage, so that if you're the developer, you could make your clients aware from all of these things, so that they can't come to you at the end of the day and go, you know what, this user experience is not that great. You can say, well, you signed off on not having it. If you're a business person and you're looking at that aspect and you're getting the product and you're paying a developer, don't be worried or upset because you're getting a product that there hasn't been user experience considered, or they're just a developer and they have no knowledge of architecture or environments like that. So I hope this has been useful information for you and you were able to get some insights. Now we're going to make more videos that covers a lot of these other subjects in more depth if you're looking at getting more specifics on them. This has already been quite a lot to cover inside of the series, but I do hope it's been useful. If you're looking for a team to work with that is experienced in all of these fields, please, links to Sinappsus, which is our digital agency in the cloud, is online. We'd love to have a conversation with you and discuss or guide you through these processes and help you make an accurate assessment. And by the way, our quote conversation is free, so feel free to just drop us a mail and set up a conversation to create an experience that's relevant to you in one of these specific areas, or into any of the others that we look for. And if you're a digital agency or you're a company and you're looking for someone to collaborate with, we also look forward to working with you and chatting with you. Till our next episode, I hope you found this valuable. I'm Jacques Argraven. Leave me your comments below if any thoughtbacks or any other videos or anything that you'd like to see adding to this channel as we start exploring it and helping you grow your business and your lifestyle. I'll see you in the next one.